Back in the early 2000s, I was looking for jobs and saw that there was an upcoming vacancy at the Sunflower Ranger Station way down in the Tonto National Forest. I was already a forest ranger at the time, stationed at the Gifford Pinchot up in Washington, but after spending almost 6 years there, I figured myself a little bit of a change of scenery. And after all that time up in the Pacific Northwest, the scenery didn't come much more different than Arizona. I had myself a solid federal resume too, with lots of experience in recreation, wildfire management, and wildlife work. The only thing going against me was that I'd never worked that far south before. But lucky for me, someone down there saw it fit to give me a chance, and so I packed my truck and then drove down to report for duty. Tonto itself is an incredible place. It's situated in central Arizona, so in the south there's miles upon miles of gray-brown desert dotted with small prickly pears and taller saguaros. Classic Sonora stretches. And then in the north, the land rises up into the much greener highlands thanks to all the mesquite trees and juniper bushes. Then there's the Mazatza Wilds, where there are plenty of pines and oak trees and where Sycamore Creek and the Salt River drainage carve deep-cut canyons through the rock. And that's where the Sunflower Ranger Station is, tucked on a flat along Sycamore Creek about 10 miles west of Pumpkin Center and a good ways south of Payson. Now at around 3,500 feet, you're in that transition zone, with steep ridges that'll make you earn every mile on patrol, but it's a solid base for covering the district. Close enough to the desert floor, but with the high country right out your back door. It's a very Depression-era setup, but it was still pretty solid when I was there. You had your main residence and office building right next to the barn, garage, shop that's got stalls, storage, and bays for the rigs. And then scattered around were a few newer sheds, a latrine, and a corral out back. And as for parking, there's a working area out front, as well as alongside the barn where the district trucks and engines pull in. Now, it's nothing paved or fancy like you'd see at the big stations, just gravel and dirt enough to turn around a trailer. And apart from when the fire guys are there in the summer, it's mostly pretty quiet up there and not some fancy visitor center. And so you can imagine my surprise one day when I walked out of the office and saw a hiker passing me on her way to the parking lot. Now, she looked to be about in her mid to late 20s, and after so long in the job, you get a feel for who's an experienced hiker and who's pretty much brand new to it. And from the tired, sick-of-it look on her face and all her fancy, brand new hiking gear, I could tell that she was relatively new to the hobby. I gave her a smile as she passed me, and then with a straight face, she told me something like, "You guys should really do something about the bugs around here." Now, I thought it was funny. The timing, the delivery, the absurdity of the idea that we could do something about hundreds of millions of flying and crawling insects, each of whom contributed in their own small way to the health of the local ecosystem, it was just funny to me. But I also made the mistake of thinking this lady was meaning to be funny because after I laughed and said something like, "If only, right?" she didn't just fail to return my smile. She stopped dead on the path, turned around, and demanded, "What the hell is so funny?" It was one of those real uh-oh kind of moments. You know the kind. When you completely misjudged a situation in person and now some a-hole with a temper tantrum decides that they're going to make their problems your problems. But since I was in uniform, I could hardly tell her to go kick rocks, and so instead, I tried to calmly and politely explain myself. I apologized, saying that I totally mistook her comment as something humorous and that I wouldn't have laughed at all had I known that she was 100% very serious. Now, remember she asked if I responded to every question in such a rude and condescending way, or if I only spoke to women like that. And then after I responded by assuring her that that wasn't the case, she once again demanded that we do something about the bugs. I took a breath, and then started very calmly explaining why we couldn't just kill all the bugs in the forest. Because A, it's impossible to get them all, and B, doing so would upset what's actually a very delicate ecosystem. Now, say we did manage to wipe out just one of the many species there. You might not notice much at first, but the critters that feed on the bugs start coming up short at supper time. Their numbers can drop, or they can go looking somewhere else for food, which in turn upsets other ecosystems. And then you got the plants to think about. Some insects pollinate flowers or chew on leaves and keep certain plants from taking over. Remove it, and one plant species might spread like wildfire while another starts disappearing. The forest isn't some collection of separate parts, it's more like a net. And if you tug hard enough on one strand, the whole thing shifts. But I didn't even get to explain all of that before the lady cut me off. She started telling me how when she went on vacation to Mexico, the hotel staff sprayed down the grounds with insecticide that looked like a thick white fog. Now, I wasn't completely familiar with the technique at the time, but I knew that it was a thing, so I tried looping around to my last point to explain why we couldn't do that. At which point, she then says, "Can't or won't?" I tried telling her that I didn't know much about the whole fogging technique, but I guess the way that I said it was a little too dismissive for her, because she started accusing me of lying, and not just lying either. She used the term gaslighting. She raised her voice and said something along the lines of, "You just told me you knew what I was talking about, now you suddenly don't?" Then started yelling, "Don't gaslight me, mister. Don't you dare try to gaslight me." Now, I didn't even know what the term meant back then, and in the context I assumed it was just slang for being disrespectful. Now, it was only later that I learned she was accusing me of trying to maliciously trick her. But regardless, as I tried to explain myself, she suddenly turned around and stormed off after giving me an exasperated huff. I kept on apologizing as I followed her towards the parking lot, but she only stopped once, and that was to get my name and badge number. Then once I told her, she turned and went towards the parking lot, as I all but begged her to give me a chance to explain. It's not unusual for people to have bad experiences with the outdoors, especially if they don't bring the actual footwear they need, or in this lady's case, enough bug spray, and I kind of pride myself on talking sense into people. I also didn't want her running off and writing up some big complaint to my boss when just a small amount of dialogue can fix all kinds of misunderstandings. But then right as we hit the parking lot and she made a beeline for her car, she turned her head and screamed, and I do mean screamed, "Stop following me!" Her scream was so shrill and sudden that it literally stopped me in my tracks. I couldn't even bring myself to say anything either. I just stood there watching her walk away thinking, what the heck just happened? But no sooner had that thought entered my head, a coworker of mine named Troy came rolling into the other end of the parking lot in his truck. Now, we saw the whole thing, so as I'm walking over to him, he gets out, walks around the other side, then gives me a nod of the head as if to ask, "The hell happened there?" Now, I walk over to him, so close that I could talk low enough so the lady wouldn't hear me, and then started telling him, in words that were less than kind, about the confrontation that I just had. Now, I told him what she said about the bugs, how it wasn't a joke, and how she freaked out after I tried to explain why I laughed. But while I'm doing this, I can hear the lady starting up her car and heading our way. I heard her wheels on the gravel, getting louder as she got closer. Then, as I was getting to the part about her yelling, "Don't follow me," Troy's gaze suddenly dropped away from me and he yelled, "Look out!" I heard the lady's engine rev as I turned and saw it coming right towards me. Troy had warned me just in time to get out of the way, but even after throwing myself back so hard I tumbled to the ground, the lady's car only barely missed me and Troy before slamming into his truck with a loud crash. I scrambled away from it and got to my feet as the lady backed up, hearing Troy yelling out, "What the hell?" from the other side of his now damaged truck. Now, I thought that she might attempt another ramming maneuver, so I rushed to put the front end of Troy's truck between us. But instead of coming at me, she sped off towards the parking lot's exit with her bumper half hanging off, and then off she went down the dirt track which led to the highway. Now, seeing as he had the better view and wasn't trying to avoid getting squished, I assumed Troy got the lady's license plate number. And so when he said he didn't and that she took off too fast for him to read it with his eyesight, as he was an older guy, I yelled something I won't repeat and then ran towards my truck and took off down the track after her. Now, she must have been going like a goddamn rally driver trying to make the distance that she had, but I managed to catch up with her just before she hit the highway, and I had her plate number memorized by the time she disappeared out of sight. It was a dang good job, too, because taking a truck like mine on a high-speed chase is a big no-no on account of how dangerous it is. I drove back to the station, called it in the local sheriff's department, and then the lady was arrested that very same evening at home. Deputies charged her with assault on a federal officer, but while she was in custody, they initiated a 5150 and placed her under psychiatric supervision for 72 hours. Now, I guess she was so out of her mind that she hit the threshold to be detained, and while most folks are released after that 3-day period, doctors saw it fit to keep her under long-term care. Realizing that there was something seriously wrong with her and she wasn't just some a-hole, it made me feel almost the complete opposite about her. At first, I was nothing but angry and spiteful, and justifiably so. The lady tried to literally do me some serious harm. But after I found out that what happened was just the start of her hitting rock bottom with regards to her psychological state, I couldn't feel anything but sorry for her. Now sure, she should have been locked up for everyone's safety, her own included, but when I remember it these days, I go back to that initial exchange in my head and think about how I was saying one thing while she was hearing something completely different. No wonder she seemed frightened. I would be too, if I was insane. I've given almost 20 years of my life to the Forest Service. It's taken me all over the country, and I've enjoyed almost every single day of my service in a job that I considered myself lucky to have. But of all the places I've served, from California and Colorado to Washington and Montana, there's one place that sticks with me more than all the others, and that's the Deep Creek Ranger Station up in Idaho's Bitterroot National Forest. It's now called Magruder Ranger Station, but to me, it'll always be Deep Creek. But what makes it different, at least one of the reasons anyway, is how secluded it is. It's about 35 miles west of Darby, Montana, if you're familiar, and when you drive out there, out in the absolute middle of nowhere, it's like driving into a whole different country. All the trees are close in, the air starts getting that sharp, clean smell to it, and signs of civilization start getting fewer and further between. And then you keep on going for a couple of miles down some dirt tracks with barely any signage until it's just trees, and trees for miles around, and that's where the station is. The ranger's house, a 2-story log place, was home base. You roll up after a long day on horseback or foot patrol, kick the mud off your boots, and know that aside from the one other ranger stationed with you, you are about as alone as it's possible to get out there. Now, it's been built in the 20s or 30s by FDR's Civilian Conservation Corps, and while it was rustic as they come, it had this real built-to-last sort of feel that made you feel safe. But living there almost meant embracing the quiet and being almost completely self-reliant. There was no corner store, no quick run to the doctor, and all our power and water came from generators and wild springs. Summers were nice, but winters were brutal, and sometimes we got snowed in so bad that we had to dig our way out. But that lifestyle has a charm to it, and after a while, you start feeling more at home out there than you do back in civilized society. And so I was out at Deep Creek for 3 stretches in the early 90s. 2 summers and 1 winter, and during my second summer, I was stationed with a fellow ranger named Gifford, or Giff for short. Now, me and Gifford made a great team. Same age, same kind of background and experience, and the same taste in music. And that was one of the things that kept the cabin fever from setting in too hard, being able to listen to all of our favorite guitar bands on what, at the time anyway, was a state-of-the-art cassette player. I guess music was one of those things that we just couldn't do without. But another thing I couldn't do without were cigarettes. You see, I've been a smoker since my teens, and while I've kicked the habit now, I was still very much a butthead back during that second summer at Deep Creek. I brought 3 whole cartons with me, one for each month that I'd be stationed there, and still, I was careful with how much I smoked because it meant driving a heck of a long way, and on back roads it was way too easy to get lost on. Now, I'd smoke one before breakfast, one after lunch, and then one right before sunset before me and Gif each hit the hay, and it became something of a little bit of a ritual for me. I'd sit at the camp table outside the cabin, light up a smoke, and then enjoy all that peace and quiet with no one or nothing to interrupt me. But then one night, something did interrupt me. A man, and one who looked like he was wearing all white. I was sitting there, just like I did every evening, only the sun hadn't quite set yet, so I was able to catch sight of him as he moved between the trees. Deep Creek might have been secluded, but it was still in a public national forest, so it wasn't entirely unusual to see someone out there. But as I said, what really caught my attention was their clothing. In all the time I've been a forest ranger, I've never seen anybody wearing white clothes out in the woods but them. Beige, maybe, but never a bright white. So as he walked between the trees, it might have been low-light conditions, he stood out like a sore thumb. Now, he didn't stop at first, just moved from tree to tree wearing what looked to be a white t-shirt and white shorts. If he had anything on his feet, they weren't white, and it also occurred to me that they didn't have a pack with them either. Now, it was strange enough of a sight that I just stood and walked parallel to them for a minute or two, just watching them, until he started watching me too. Now, I could tell it was a guy from the way he walked, but then he suddenly stopped walking and turned to face me. I stood there looking at him, and he stood there looking at me, and all the while I'm just thinking, just who the hell is that dressed like they're in a gospel choir? Now, when I finished my smoke and stubbed it out, the guy in white was still looking at me. And so, not being one to antagonize some stranger, I just turned and started walking back to the cabin. But not before looking over my shoulder and checking if he was still there. But that time, the man in white was nowhere to be seen. I told Gif about the guy before heading to bed, and he said that the guy sounded like some crazy kind of hippie, one who probably thought that I was a hallucination caused by whatever was in his brownies. Now, I thought that sounded about right, and then by the next morning, I'd just about forgotten the man in white and didn't think about that creepy dude again until Gif brought him up after a patrol the next afternoon. Now, he spotted him apparently out in his truck, standing up on a ridge, and then when he got to the bottom of this winding road that took him down the mountain, this dude in white was standing near the bottom, right at the side of the road that he drove past. Now, this wasn't like an impossible feat or anything. He could have gotten down if he rode a tree down from the ridge and then ran down the hill as fast as he could. But that's just it. If he did run, he had to have run as fast as a freaking jackrabbit down that slope. And so, hippie or no hippie, both me and Gil found ourselves thinking, hell, that boy can move. And while it was strange, he hadn't done anything really threatening yet. But it was coming all right. We just didn't know it yet, and when it got there, it was bad. Me and Gif didn't see this guy in white again, not during the daytime anyway. And so we really did figure that he was just some hippie type who'd spent a few days out there wandering the woods and hugging trees. But then one night, we're sitting in the cabin after a long day of fire watching and trail maintenance when I decided to head out for my nightly smoke. I sat down, grabbed one of the pack, and lit it up, but I don't think that I was more than a few drags in before I heard that scream cutting through the darkness ahead of me. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either, so after making very sure that the cigarette was out, I ran into the cabin to grab my rifle and then went running off through the trees in the direction that I heard the scream from. Gif was close behind me with a flashlight, and I remember it bobbing up and down ahead of me as each of us yelled out, "Hello," and "Who's out there?" and all of that. Now, it wasn't long before he heard a response. Someone yelling out for help close by. And after that, it was easy to close in on him, and I honestly expected to see that man in white in Gift's flashlight beam, having had a run-in with a pack of wolves or some mountain lion or something. But it wasn't him. It was some hiker wearing all the clothes that you might expect one to. He was lying on his back, screaming for us to help him, and I remember how pale he looked in the light. But it wasn't until we got close enough to see it that he started screaming, "My leg! My leg!" And for as long as I live, I'll never forget the feelings of shock and horror that I felt when I saw his leg was missing just below the knee. Although his pack was lying nearby, his severed leg was nowhere to be seen, but the amount of blood pumping out of the stump meant that simply wasn't a priority. The only thing that mattered in the moment was saving this guy's life. And so with Giff covering me with the rifle and flashlight, I tied my belt around the guy's leg as a sort of makeshift tourniquet. And then once I was sure that I'd stemmed the bleeding, I got him on his feet. Now we kept asking him what happened, but all he said at first was, "I don't know," before going back to begging us to help him. We promised we'd do everything we could, but that we had to get him moving, because assuming it was a predator of some kind that took his leg, we were all still in danger. I asked him that too, if it was wolves or a cougar, maybe even a bear, but all he said was, "I don't know," and then begged us to bring his leg with us. Again, that just was not a priority. We had to get him back to the station and then call for help on the radio as quickly as possible, but the most important thing of all was not getting caught by whatever took this dude's leg. Now, I was the one who helped him move, so I couldn't look back to see if anything was following us. Giff could, and that was kind of his whole job, but every time I asked him if he saw anything, he just said no. We managed to get the wounded man back to the station. Then as Giff started working on him with the first aid kit, I jumped on the radio to call in a medical evac. Now I knew that was the only real option available to us, so they had no real choice but to call in the chopper. And then call it in they did, and they showed up in those bright orange suits that they used to wear, running up the clearing with a stretcher and medical supplies. The paramedics treated him, and then they carried him back to the hospital after complimenting my tourniquet skills. But before they showed up, we had maybe 20 to 30 minutes with our amputee hiker, and while he didn't say all that much, what he did say had us scared as hell as the helicopter took off and flew away. Now, we didn't have much in the way of medical supplies at the station, but only in comparison to a hospital or some such. We still had enough to bandage the stump, apply an actual tourniquet, and even get some morphine in him to get him stabilized and a little more comfortable. Or at least as comfortable as a man can be after something just took his leg off. And then once we had him stabilized and able to talk a little more, we once again started asking him what happened out there. And again, he kept saying that he didn't know, but only in response of what it was that took his leg. He said he was just walking through the woods after a long day's hike, looking for a good place to set up camp, when he kind of lost track of time and had the sun go down on him. Now he keeps walking, thinking that one perfect pitching spot was just right over the hill, when out of nowhere, he hears a rush of air next to him. He said it was loud, like something came at him really fast, and then a sudden force had him sprawled out on the ground like a freight train just appeared and smashed into him. The next thing he knew, he had this intense pain in his lower leg, and then when he looked at it, he saw it was missing below the knee. And that's when I heard his first scream and went rushing through the woods to try and find him. But in that time, while he was lying there screaming, he didn't see or hear anyone or anything moving around him. It was like whatever took his leg off just disappeared into the darkness again, and at lightning speed. It was the speed issue that later had us thinking about the guy in white. I can't imagine how or why he might have done something like that. It just seemed like too much of a coincidence that we saw this strange guy out in the woods, and then the next hiker passing through got his freaking leg taken off, and with such a clean and obviously man-made cut, too. We didn't ask him about any man in white, and I regretted not doing so for a while, but Giff convinced me that it wouldn't have mattered if I did. If the guy saw someone dressed like that, he would have said something, and if not to us, then to the cops who talked to him after the criminal investigation started. But he didn't say anything about him. It was only me and Giff who had encountered him, or maybe it's the case that only me and Giff saw him, and he hit the hiker so hard that he managed to disappear without being spotted again. And if, that is, you can believe a man wearing white clothes can just disappear like that, and under the light of an almost full moon, too. Like I said, Giff and I stayed awfully spooked for a while after we saved that hiker, and we didn't sleep until dawn, as we pretty much couldn't, and so we patrolled the perimeter of the station instead with our guns and flashlights at the ready. We didn't stray into those woods at all, and we'd have been fools to do something like that under the circumstances, but if someone was coming for us, we wanted to be ready for them when they got there, not lying in our beds, just dead to the world. And we never saw the guy in white again. Some sheriff's deputies came out to look for the guy's leg and ask us a few questions, but they didn't find anything, and we didn't hear back from anyone else about what happened to that poor hiker. Not from fellow law enforcement anyway, it was just really internet stuff. Nothing ever dramatic or terrifying ever happened again while I was stationed out there at Deep Creek, but that's what makes me think about it all the more and how strange and horrifying it all was, because if it happened once, it could sure as hell happen again to someone else, and if it does, I wonder if someone else will spot a strange figure walking through the woods just days before it happens. You can call me Ranger Mike, and I've been with Parks Canada for coming up on 8 years now. I grew up in Alberta and spent many a summer volunteering with trail crews in the mountains, and then after doing a park and rec program in college, along with working a few seasons at smaller provincial sites, then I got myself posted to Jasper National Park back in 2018, and working here has been pretty special. We do everything from guided tours to search and rescue, and we get to do it in one of the most beautiful places on Earth. Now, it's hard work, long hours, but you never get tired of the views, and getting to call an entire provincial park the office is something that never gets old either. Every summer, and like a lot of places, the park runs a network of fire lookouts. We have a bunch of towers on the ridges and mountain tops, then as soon as fire season ramps up, we used to staff them with trained observers who'd live up there for a whole season. Now, a lot of the towers are completely automated these days and rely on a bunch of fancy sensors and whatnot. And if you're wondering, why spend millions of dollars on all of these top-of-the-line electronics that are also expensive to maintain when you can pay someone a few $1,000 for the season? The story I got here might well shed some light on that. Their job is a pretty simple one. Scan the horizon all day with binoculars and spotting scopes looking for smoke or flames, and then when they spot something suspicious, they radio it in right away with the exact location using maps and bearings. Now, that early warning gives crew time to get on the fire before it grows, and since lightning and dry weather can make it serious business here in the Rockies, the lookouts play an important role in protecting the park and all the animals that call it home. And probably the most famous of all the lookouts, though she came before my time, was a lady by the name of Stephanie Stewart. 70-year-old Steph was a legend around the park and had spent more than half of her 18-year career at the isolated Athabasca Lookout, which is up on the high ridge in the far northwest of Jasper. Only a single desolate road leads up from the valley floor, and if you follow it, it'll take you to the 40-foot high lookout and accompanying log cabin that stand near the peak. That might sound a little too much for a woman in her late 60s and eventually 70s, but to Steph, age was never an issue. Just a few years before her final lookout, she completed a solo bike ride across Canada and even flew over to Africa to climb Mount Kilimanjaro. She might have been a sweet old lady, but from what I heard, she was tough and she was reliable. And to me, that makes what happened to her all the more strange and all the more frightening. Whenever she was on duty, Steph's supervisor at the Natural Resources Group would call her each morning to make sure that she was okay. They'd talk shop, keep each other updated on the situation and resupply needs, and then the super would hang up and go about checking on the other lookouts stationed around the park. But on the morning of August 26th, way back in 2006, the first few calls from Steph's supervisor went unanswered, and when someone did answer the phone, they stayed quiet and then hung up. The supervisor tried again to get Steph on the phone, but that final call got that "we are unable to connect your call right now" message, like the phone had suddenly been disconnected. And as you can imagine, Steph's supervisor was very concerned by such a worrying turn of events, and so they drove out to the Athabasca lookout right away. Now, he found her truck parked outside, and then when he checked the cabin, he found a pot of water boiling on the stove, all signs that Stephanie was close by. But when he looked around, calling out her name as he went, he slowly realized that she wasn't there. And that's when he saw the blood. I've heard different things from different people regarding where the blood was. Some say it was on the stairs leading up to the lookout. Others say it was all over the porch. Some say both, and there was blood all over the place up there. But either way, it was enough for the super to call the Mounties, and after her super made the call, Steph was officially reported missing that same morning. I actually spoke to a search and rescue guy named Mark a while back, and it was him who turned me on to Steph's story in the first place. He was the guy who managed the initial search, and with the help of Steph's supervisor, he worked out that, along with a gold watch, a whole bunch of bedding had been taken from her cabin. Now, he said he took it personal, because where he lived, he could actually see the Athabasca lookout tower from his back porch, way up there on the mountain. He'd spent many a sunny afternoon looking up at that thing, sipping a beer and wondering who was up there, and so to think something bad had happened to them, like I said, he took it personally. And of all the rescue attempts he wished could have gone differently, he said that one topped his list. Once the Mounties were involved, they were able to quickly rule out any kind of animal attack based on forensics alone. The gold watch being missing was a dead giveaway that a person was to blame for what happened to her, and seeing as Steph made a call to her family that previous night, during which she'd sounded right as rain, it was safe to say whoever took her crept up on her during the night. But what I find particularly creepy is that detail about the boiling water. All that blood was spilled hours before Steph's super got there, and seeing as it was confirmed to be hers, it's unlikely she put that water onto that boil herself. This means the man who took her did it, and that he did God knows what to her and then put some water on a boil like he wanted to make himself some morning coffee. But when he heard Steph's super rolling up the track in his truck, he ran before he could be spotted. But that also means that he did something with Steph's body first, before he put that water to the boil. Either that, or he was strong enough to pick up her body and run real fast with it, and with Steph being 5'2" and pretty skinny, that's actually a very frightening, plausible possibility. Like I said, no one ever found Steph's body, so it wasn't clear if she had been killed there at the lookout or taken someplace for something even worse. There was a massive search effort, too. That Mark guy said it was the biggest that Jasper had ever seen, but apart from the blood around the cabin and lookout, not a single other trace of Steph was found around the forest. Mark said it was freaky, like Steph and her attacker had just straight up vanished, and there was a lot of people online who say all kinds of dumb things about Sasquatches and aliens and werewolves and all sorts of stuff. But there's other people, Mark and myself included, who think there's much more down-to-earth types of explanations, and his name is Travis Vader. Aside from sharing a name with a literal supervillain, Vader is a convicted murderer serving time for killing an elderly couple in British Columbia back in 2010. Vader killed them, but more importantly, he robbed them too. He also disposed of their bodies in a place that they'd never be found, refused to say where he put them, and no matter how hard the authorities try, they can't seem to find them. But not only that, Vader's alibi for Steph's murder places him within 30 minutes drive of that lookout, which most definitely places him quote-unquote in the area, and should have had him investigated as the case's #1 suspect. But then here's the thing. RCMP did nothing of the sort. Even after his conviction, when it became obvious that he was most likely the killer, they didn't question him, let alone declare him a person of interest. And to me, it almost feels like they know something they're not telling us. Instead of charging Vader, the cops had Parks Canada almost change their policies regarding access and training. First off, they blocked off public access to the road leading up to the lookout, and trespassers can now be prosecuted for straying onto government land. Then secondly, and in addition to a bunch of training, every lookout and cabin has been considerably upgraded. Each is now surrounded by lockable gates and fencing, and all the surrounding brush has been removed to improve visibility and makes it easier to spot anyone approaching. Windows and door locks have been improved too. Panic buttons have been installed at each location, and potential lookouts have to undergo mandatory self-defense training. And while everyone appreciated the massive safety upgrade, particularly Steph's daughter, who only wanted to make sure that it couldn't happen again, every so often I get to wondering what prompted that very expensive reaction. Now, was it really out of respect for such a dedicated and beloved member of the Parks team? Or was it because of something else? To automate all those watchtowers and turn others into little forts, it's almost like the authorities know they're up against someone or something they can't protect people from. And although I've always appreciated Jasper for how beautiful it is, I know there are corners of it that aren't so beautiful. And no matter where we are out there or what we're doing, no one can ever truly be safe in a place as wild as this. I've been a U.S. Forest Ranger for 18 years now, and in that time, I feel as if I've not just seen the best and worst of nature, but the best and worst of humanity too. I've seen things so beautiful I wish I'd taken photographs of them, but I've also seen things that make me wish I could reach into my own mind and pluck out whatever piece of my brain is holding the memories of them. And unfortunately for you, this story is about the second kind, and one that does not have a happy ending. So what feels like a lifetime ago, I was stationed at the Wapiti Ranger Station in the Shoshone National Forest. It's actually kind of a special place, as not only is it the longest continually active ranger station in the state of Wyoming, but it's the oldest Forest Service ranger station in the entire United States. About 30 miles west of Cody, the original 1903 is now one of a cluster of more modern USFS buildings, all surrounded by a rail fence. And back in the summer of 2010, it was my home during a 3-month stay out there in the woods. We'd see a lot of hikers going past, either heading out or coming back from someplace, and sometimes they'd ask us questions about the surrounding trails or just the forest in general. And then one day, I stepped outside to see a young man and a woman walking through the open gate. After giving them a wave and asking if I could help them, the young man asked how to get to the one particular beauty spot about 2 miles from the station, and the second he said its name, I realized what was happening. See, this beauty spot was a very popular spot for marriage proposals, and we had at least 3 or 4 guys a season taking their girls up there for a beautiful backdrop when they popped the question. It was cute, I guess. They'd stop by the station to get directions, and you'd always see the excitement and nervousness in the young man's face while his girl remained blissfully ignorant. And it was no different on that day when I walked outside and had that young man ask where the beauty spot was. In the moments after, we shared a very knowing look. I knew what he was planning, and he could tell that I knew. And so after giving him a nod and a very wry smile, I addressed him with as much courtesy and respect as I could muster, not just because it might boost his chances, but because I admired the balls of it. You see, my wife and I had the total opposite of a romantic proposal. We found out that she was pregnant, and she said, well, we better get married, I guess. And then that was that. 2 weeks later, we had a courthouse marriage. And so I really admired these kids for putting it all on the line like that. One couple even stopped by to thank us for giving them directions, but sadly, not on that day. Because after giving them directions and having the excited young man thank me and walk off with his girlfriend, they didn't come back. A couple of days later, I was sitting in the office building when I heard a knock on the door. And then, when I went to see who it was, I found a missing persons detective from the state police standing there. He had a picture to show me, and I recognized the girl in it right away because it was the same one who had been standing next to that young man in just blissful ignorance as he asked me directions to that beauty spot. The detective said that he managed to track down her last known location to this forest, and then, after asking if I'd seen her, I told him sure, and then walked him out to the beauty spot. Now, on the way, I told him all about how it was a popular spot for proposals and how it wouldn't surprise me if the couple were either camped out there or had eloped on some post-engagement honeymoon in a state of loved-up giddiness, I guess. Now, I remember laughing when I said that, and the detective kind of smiled, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. No, they stayed cold, and what we saw next made me realize why they'd stayed that way. When we made it to the beauty spot, it looked like it always had. A small hill crested above a gentle slope which led down to a stream with a meadow full of wildflowers beyond it. It was just as pretty as I remembered it, and the detective agreed that it was a fine spot for a proposal. But then, we both looked down, and we saw them. Lying on the soft soil beneath us, one behind the other, were the two missing kids. The girl's head had been partially blown away by what must have been a point-blank shot, and while there was no obvious wounds to the male, it later came out that he'd bled out from a self-inflicted gunshot wound to his own stomach. Now, the picture that emerged was a horrifying one, easily one of the most haunting, heart-wrenching things that I've ever had the misfortune of coming across as a forest ranger. Boy proposes to girl, having been sure as anything that she'd say yes. When she said no, he lost his mind for a moment and shot her. Maybe he didn't even say no. Maybe she said a whole lot of things before he pulled the trigger. But whatever it was, it probably wasn't yes. And so our young man, with his bright future ahead of him, chose to throw it all away over a moment of wounded pride. Now, we think he came to his senses after he watched his girl's dead body tumbling down the slope, and then knowing that he couldn't deal with the consequences of his own actions and wanting nothing more than to lie with his beloved during the final moments of his life, our would-be groom chose to end this on his own terms, the slow and painful way. Having seen him lying there like that, I don't think I'll ever stop being haunted by the look on his face. He died in agony, both physical and emotional, and it read all over his cold, lifeless face as we looked down at him. And then the image of a man cradling a much smaller woman whose skull you can see into because it had been torn open by a bullet. That sure as hell was something that I wish I could forget too. Now, I don't feel sorry for him. I think he got what he deserved in a strange sense, and it's the girl that I feel sorry for, the one who wasn't given any choice in the matter. She went out with him that day not knowing what was coming, what was really coming, I mean, and I found myself hoping to God that it was quick and that she didn't have to suffer too much or be scared for too long. Now, I don't work at Wapiti anymore, and I'm not stationed at Shoshone either, but a while back I called the station there and asked if anyone had been up to that beauty spot recently. The ranger I spoke to was familiar with what happened and told me that the last time he was up there, he'd found a bouquet of wildflowers someone had picked from the meadow and laid at the crest of the hill. I know the girl must have had family, probably friends too, and it was probably one of them who went to spend some time where she died and leave something to memorialize her with. But it was still nice to think that it wasn't just me that thought about her, and how incredibly unfair it all is that her life was just snatched away from her like that. Even though it's been 15 years now, I remember that day like it was yesterday. My name's Tom, by the way, and I've been a USFS Ranger up in the Pacific Northwest for the past 25 years. And while I've most definitely seen a lot of strange crap in my time, I never saw anything quite like this fella that I'm about to tell you about. So it was a quiet Tuesday afternoon in the late summer of 2011, and I was at the station, feet up and sipping some coffee while going over some trail reports. It was hot outside too, so I had all the windows open ajar just to let in that sweet, cool air while hopefully keeping the bugs out. But then I heard it. The sound of a man yelling in the distance, and right away I knew that this was different. It wasn't like a celebratory woo or someone hollering for help. These were like primal animal sounds, like he was mad, but crazy mad, if that makes sense. Now, we're no different from regular law enforcement when it comes to enforcing the law and powers of arrest. So if someone out there is breaching the peace and posing a danger to either themselves or others, we're obligated to do something about it. So even though the sound alone was enough to give me chills, I grabbed my radio, sidearm, and a first aid kit, and then was out the door and moving steadily towards the sound of the shouts. Now, I didn't call it in right away because there was still a chance that it was just some drunk camper or a group of frat boys or something like that. But if it was anything bigger than I could handle, I had my portable right there. And thank God I brought it too, because I sure as heck ended up needing it. I moved through the underbrush that came up to about my knees as quiet as I could. The shouts kept coming, getting louder as I got closer. But as I closed in on him, I started hearing these wet thumping noises that right away struck my nerves on edge. I crept up over this little rise, staying low behind some bushes, and then suddenly, there he was, maybe 15 to 20 yards ahead of me in a small clearing. Now, the guy had his back to me, but he was completely buck naked, with pale skin all scratched up from the brush. And while kneeling at the base of a tree, he was bashing his head against the trunk over and over again. I guess I must have been frozen for a second because I remember just sort of watching him go at it as I felt myself getting sicker and sicker. But that's also how I heard him whispering something under his breath, and the only part that I heard fully was, "Got to get it out." We later found out the guy had choked down something like 15 grams of dried psilocybin, or magic mushrooms as they're called on the street, which constitutes what might be referred to as a catastrophic overdose, considering most people only chew up a gram or two. The guy was tripping so hard that he thought the fungus had gotten into his brain, and the only way to fix it was to crack his skull open and do brain surgery on himself, right there against a tree in the middle of nowhere. Something that I wasn't about to let happen, though. Now, I kept my pistol low at first, not wanting to antagonize him directly, and then announce myself as I broke into the clearing while imploring him to stop what he was doing. The guy just whipped around all crazy. Blood was smeared across his face, and for a second or two, he just stared at me with his chest heaving and the blood dripping off of his chin. And then, after letting out what was honestly a terrifying roar, he charges at me. Now, he came at me full tilt, leaned forward and ready to tackle me, but this poor son of a bitch was so dizzy from bashing his own head to pieces that he only made it about 10 feet before his legs just buckled. He went down hard, face planting into the dirt, and I was on him quick, dropping a knee into his back and struggling with him until his arms were pinned. Now, when the fight went out of him, he started mumbling stuff again, but he was too tired out and messed up for me to make any sense of it. I used these flex cuffs on him, which were pretty much zip ties once I was sure that I was able to, and then gave his facial wounds a look after rolling him over. And it was bad, really bad, and I knew that he needed urgent hospital treatment if he'd managed to do any damage to its brain. Now, I called it in on the radio before wrapping his head in some gauze, and then after that it was just a case of keeping him calm until backup showed up. And while we waited, I covered him with this space blanket from my pack as he seemed to sort of drift in and out of consciousness. And that's the one time he managed to say anything I understood, and even then, it was just a variation on the first thing when he asked me to help him get it out. I just nodded along and told him help was on the way. I didn't even know he was on mushrooms at that point either, so I just felt terrible for him. And when the ambulance crew showed up, they took one look at him before loading him up and taking him away. And the last I heard is that he spent a week or two in the hospital and then he was released without any further psych treatment. I went back to the station that evening, wrote up that report, and just sat there shaking my head. Forest Service work ain't all smoky bear hats and campfire talks. You deal with some really messed up stuff sometimes. And years later, I still think about him sometimes when I'm out on patrol. I guess some folks come out here chasing something, be it peace or adventure or escape. And I suppose not all of them find what they're looking for if we're going to get all philosophical about it. But that guy found it all right, and then he took it so close to the edge that he fell right off completely. And just as a side note, if you ever head into the forest, stick to the trails, tell somebody where you're going, and for God's sake, leave the hallucinogens at home. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams on Sundays and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email, letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and you might even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories and big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. I also have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul. All links are in the description below. Thanks so much, friends, and I'll see you again soon.